Imagination. The religious imagination in reading Torah. That was the title I gave this year's course. Question mark. That is, I put a question mark in, if you may have noticed, in the title. It happened to appear here. I forgot to put it in this time. Maybe my questions had been answered a little bit already. The question is, of course, that at least in certain circles, and there are certain voices in me also, that raise an eyebrow at the idea of imagination in Torah. It's emunah, let's say. Emunah. Does imagine? If you don't know how to fill in this space I've opened up, then that's just good, because we won't make trouble. But I'm making trouble for myself. And the trouble is imagination a category that's worth thinking about as a way in which we can consider from a point of view of reading Torah as an essential part of the religious life of human beings? An essential part of the life of human beings in general, question mark, and of religious human beings. And when I came upon this because I read a fascinating study of the imagination in the history and literature and theology of southern India. David Shulman, who is a great expert, has written a wonderful book about this. And of course, the southern Indian culture and world is worlds apart from the Jewish world. But it was fascinating, and it opened up in my mind a possibility. And that's the question mark. What would we think about if we thought about imagination? So I start right away. If I think in general about imaginations, what came to my mind was something that the poet William Blake said. He knew something about imagination. He said the imagination is not a state. It is the human existence itself. And that's a huge claim. It doesn't just have a place and a moment, a state. Sometimes I feel imaginative. But actually, it's what it is to be a human being altogether, is to use imagination. Imagination is with us all the time, in our ways of looking at each other, in our ways of understanding. Yes. In our ways of understanding. Any better?
No, the mic's for Zoom. I'm not sure it's closer. Is it not?
It's not working?
No, the mic is for the Zoom to hear.
That was done to, oh, sorry, but yes. Perhaps you can move closer. There are some seats in front.
So much noise outside too, right? If you close the window, it'll feel better.
So for Blake, it's simply, how does he say it? It is the human existence itself. It's at least an ikar, something essential to the human existence. As I began to delve into my material for Lech Lecha, I found what seems to me many and fruitful avenues from which to begin to glimpse our subject. How are we going to look at it now? Before we get to Lech Lecha, I want to take just a few minutes, keeping my eye on the clock, to preface Lech Lecha with a rather important parsha that we have missed, which is Parshat Breshit and Noach. But Breshit, that is the beginning of the human project altogether. And it's put really as a project. God doesn't just say, let there be man, and then there's man, as he does with everything else. All other living creatures, everything else actually, yehi or, let there be light, and there was light. When it comes to the human being, words won't do it. Words won't cut it, at least not to start with. At the beginning, what does there have to be? There has to be God saying, all right, he's still saying, Vayomer, if you want to look at it, and if you have a Chumash, it's Perik Aleph Pasuk Chaf Vav, 126, 125, 26. Vayomer Elokim naaseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make Adam. Don't translate it yet. We don't know what this Adam is yet. We're reading the Torah for the first time. What is Adam? In our likeness and in our image. And what the difference between the two might be, we won't talk about. These are interesting, but different different order questions. I'm thinking in general now, what can it mean for God to say, we're going to make a thing, an Adam, who's going to be in some way essentially like us? Now, the plural has received a lot of attention. If you've learned Rashi in your youth, you'll be very familiar. What does Rashi say? It's very sweet. It's very beautiful. Rashi says, the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, risked the dangers of giving heretics a heyday. That the heretics would seize on this plural. And they would say, aha, you see, there isn't only one God, there's a whole plethora of gods up there. There's no single God, because it says it in the plural, let us make. And Rashi addresses that implicitly by saying, this, if we didn't have it like that, we wouldn't have learned the essential lesson on which the whole Torah is based, in a sense. That of anvatanut. Anvatanut is a kind of belabored anava. An anava, but with a particular tone to it. I don't know if I want to try to define it now. It's a courteousness that's associated with humility, right? It's not a brash humility. It's a, yeah. How do you see the anvatanut of God? That he alone made man, but he saw that the angels were a bit jealous. That the angels around him were a bit jealous of a rival to their power in the universe, in the cosmos. We're going to have someone else now down there who is like us, who's made by God in his image. And in order to allay their anxiety, he does the democratic thing. Now, the whole idea of democracy, you might say, just occurred to me, you might say if you want to, you might say is based on envy. It's based on the fact that people want for themselves. They see what someone else has, they want it for themselves. You have power, you do all the talking. Yeah, I want some of that. I want to dominate. And somewhere that's a given of human life, of political life, certainly. And so God has a political, social, relational sense of his world. It's very anthropomorphic. And he doesn't want the angels to be jealous, so he consults them. And that's what you should do too. If you are a big, important person, then you should consult those who are under you, because then you forestall trouble, which is the trouble of that exists not only in the lower worlds, but in the upper worlds as well, it seems. Right. So it's a very humanoid, very humanistic kind of insight. In other words, God is using his, anthropomorphism, God is using his ethical imagination. I wouldn't say religious imagination, but ethical imagination. How should you behave? How should you be a mensch? So he is setting the model for Adamness, for what it is to be a mensch, and v'tanut. There are lots of other midrashim in this vein, but I'm trying to be very disciplined. Let's go straight on. Na'aseh, what can it mean in our, never mind the plural, my image? A human being is not like God. God is essentially different. What have we got here? You're talking about almost like a representation of God, a full representation of God. Can't be. So some of the commentaries say, some of the sources that say, it doesn't refer to being like God. It means to imitate his midot, his ways of behaving, right? If I put it very prosaically. You should regard God as your model, and because even though he's out of reach, in a sense, he's not entirely out of reach. There's something about his behavior that you can translate into your terms. And you can make sense of it within the framework of your structures, your ways of thinking. And these have to do with ethics again. But just as he is compassionate, so you be compassionate. Right? In that way, you'll be copying the ways of God, not God himself, the personality of God, the uniqueness of God, but the manifestations of God, let's say, the rays that reach us. All right, but that also takes a little imagination to think of that. But I want to suggest that perhaps that's not the whole story. That if it says, yes, if it says, Na'aseh Adam, B'Tsalmenu Kidmutenu, then something more is meant than this. And what follows on this, next verse, Pasuk Chaver, is what God then does. The project is there in the first verse. This is the project. This is the kind of human being I want to create. Someone who will use me, my behaviors, as a forming principle in their own lives. And then next verse, Vayivra Elokim et Adam. And so then God did create man, B'Tsalmo, B'Tselem Elokim bara oto. In his image. Whose image? God's. It sounds like it. Rashi says no. And he makes the verse much more interesting. Rashi says no, but Salmo means bitfus hamiyuchad lo, Adam. God made the human being in his own unique image that was specially prepared for him. That's what God had in mind. God imagined. I don't think there's anything wrong in using the word imagined here. God imagined someone, something, who would be in his own particular kind of being. And there's a tfus. God had prepared a kind of mold for this, like preparing coins, that you have to prepare I've forgotten what the word that's used for, what you use to cast a coin. And it turns out that B'Tsalmo is also B'Tselem Elokim. And
Die.
I think you're right. Very good. Very good. Yes. It is a die. D-I-D-Y.
Which is a
Yes.
die.
The form that's prepared for casting coins. That's the image that Rashi and the Midrash gives. All right. But then Rashi emphasizes the fact that, all right, but Salmo refers to Adam. But B'Tselem Elokim, of course, refers clearly to Elokim. And he says that special way of being Adam is the way that God has of being too. That's what unites. It's the same Tselem. Just quite if you've been using your imagination, then already you see what Rashi, I always used to claim that Rashi is a poet. And I got that from my father, Zechrono Livracha, who really felt it and transferred it to me. Rashi has a sensitivity here about what faculties we need to be using here. And then we're told that it's not just one creature, but actually it's an otam. There's a plurality of two among the Adam. There is also his wife. There is that two-ness built in. So there's a complexity inside what sounds like a single mold. But it's a mold that can transform itself. That's Rashi again, quoting Midrash. It's a mold that sounds as if all you get is one thing, one stamp. No, it's strangely a mold. I don't understand it. It must be something to do with casting a die, that kind, that you can turn it to make all kinds of different shapes. I don't have any knowledge of the craft to be able to convey it, but that's what he says. What is particular, and Rashi then goes on to say, and this is where we really take off, about that particular shape, form, that is to be Adam's shape and form, that God, as we said before, God didn't make Adam b'ma'amar, by saying, let there be man, as he did everything else, but b'yadayim. Yes, b'yadayim, with his hands.
What does that mean, though? He doesn't have hands.
What?
He doesn't have hands, so what does that
Well,
mean?
yeah,
Rashi wasn't worried about it.
Rashi is way beyond that. He assumes you understand that we're talking. That we're talking. Right. So what did you say? Yeah. All right. Anthropomorphism. But when you say anthropomorphism, don't be too glib about it. Oh, that's an anthropomorphism. I don't have to think about it anymore. On the contrary, you're supposed to think about it. What do you mean by Yadayim? That is, it's as if God's mind has hands. He's imagining hands what for a human being would be hands, he uses them. And what would that be? And I want to make a suggestion here. It's not what Rashi says on this verse, but it's what he says elsewhere. At the beginning of the second chapter of Rashi, before man is created, Adam is created. It's a different story, a different version of the history, in chapter 2. Adam ayin la, there is no Adam. There is an absence of Adam. Now, right away, again, there's an imagining mind here. Why is I need an Adam here? This is really odd. I expect to find an Adam. Adam is necessary here. Who thinks this? It must be God. He's the only consciousness around. So all right. And so then Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam me'afar ha'adamah. Then the Lord God, it's a perik bet pasuk hey or so. The Lord God formed Vayitzer, like Yetzer, used his creative abilities to project into clay this image of man. Where do we get clay from? From afar ha'adamah. There's dust of the earth, but you can't do anything with dry dust. You can't form dust into anything. For God to get to work with his hands, kavayachol, yes, as it were, there needs to be water. And that's why the absence of rain is remarked on. No rains had fallen. That's why there can't be an Adam. Because in order to have an Adam, you need dust mixed with rain. And then you have clay, as the philosopher and aesthetician Gaston Bachelard puts it, the French. He's written many wonderful books about what he calls the material imagination. The imagination that somewhere works with our senses is based on a sensuality. He says, for instance, someone who works in clay, he can only begin to work once there is water, obviously. So water is the essential addition to dry dust. We're not going to say clearly what water stands for yet, but it's what it makes it possible to make the dust into something pliable, or as Rashi himself says, I mean, it's hard to believe, it's right there in Rashi. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam me'afar ha'adamah. He says, kagavalze, like this baker, not even a craftsman, like this baker, asher lash et ha'isa, who kneads the dough. And that's what it means to form a creature, right? And Adam, therefore, is chala. This is the first chala of the world. I'm not sure where that comes from. It's not in Rashi, but it's clear that's what's being made here, a loaf of bread. But it's called chala. I think it's called chalato rishona shel ha'olam. I don't know where that is. In any case, you see Hashem not just saying airily, let there be man. And the tradition doesn't focus when it thinks about what's essential, what's interesting and powerful about the human being as opposed to all other creatures. Could say very easily, but it says after he formed him, he breathed into his nostrils. And that's a nice spiritual image. There, we don't have to get too material about it. The idea of breathing life into, all right, life, spirit. All right, we're comfortable. The spiritual idea.
Finally, right?
Pardon?
Finally.
Yes. But no, Rashi goes to the material stages. He stays with that stage. And he says there's something about that avodah b'yadayim, that is something of the essence of the creativity of human beings, and we get it from God. That is, it's the most direct gift. That when the challenge that God set himself, as it were, is to make someone who would also be able to enter into that process of work b'yadayim. And so God engages in this prosaic work of kneading dough, which becomes, if one thinks about it, I mean, I speak as someone who's had minimal experience of kneading dough, And that in the past tense, which of course puts me in the best possible position for talking about it. Because I remember it now as a poetic, I remember the essence of it, not the hard work that went into it. And so I go along with Bachelard, who talks about the process of kneading clay, of constantly working clay. What you're doing essentially, he says, it's quite a challenging idea. He says it's not to create an image. We're not looking to create a form. We're actually looking, when we do this work, to deform images. We don't want to be, we're not satisfied with the first plausible shape that turns up, and we might be tempted to, but if we are artists, we're not satisfied. And we keep on kneading, we keep on exploring the inner, intimate depths of that calls it like vegetable, dynamic stuff, that stuff out of which life has to emerge. And it's the livingness of the process that's the important thing. He has a wonderful line in which he says, forms need completion. If you have a form, a sculpture, it needs to be complete. You're irritated if it's incomplete. Matter, never. That is, matter doesn't need to be completed. You just get your hands in there, and if you enjoy it, you enjoy it sensually. Going into internalizing, going down into the internal depths of things, it becomes not even symbolic. You can't say it's symbolic because it's a physical activity that stands on its own in a way. Another of his sentences that I like, a stable and completed image, he says, clips the wings of the imagination. So what do I do with that? There it is now. You've got the Statue of Liberty, and everyone has more or less the same reaction to the Statue of Liberty. We all know the associations, they're powerful associations, but you can't go anywhere with that. It's when material is in dynamic process and we have our hands right in it and we are working with it. That is Chaim, and in the sense of creative life. Can we leave it to the end? Because I forgot to mention that I try to just speak and get out what I want to say, and then at the end, I'm very interested in hearing. So that kind of work is, he says, how do we pull the image loose from the too stable bedrock of our familiar memories? How does God manage? Right? Perhaps he has a certain stock in trade. He knows this and that. He wants to create something new, something that has a power of forming itself, something that has a power of becoming. Okay? But it'll always be clay. It won't be a stable, completed image, but it will always be open to the imagination. And it will always be something in the imagination that leads one, not just this, there must be something beyond this, that it penetrates the surface. What does the imagination do? It penetrates the surfaces of things, the forms, the prettiness, the nice flower. That's all very well, but that's not really what art does. It doesn't create nice flowers. What art does is create something new, and something that in a sense is turbulent. It's alive. You can feel it in the dough, I seem to remember. As you fold it over, it's got an elasticity and malleability that's almost as if it's trying to create itself. It's trying to form itself. It's got a will of its own. And you are dealing then with two things at the same time. Not with one stable image, but flour and water. And if you have too much of the one and too much of the other, you're not going to get the right amount of. Now,
Excuse me, the sound went off. Aviva, the sound is off for the Zoom. Sorry.
Okay, someone's going to the office. I hope they'll bring help. Okay, let's go to Lech Lecha now.
It's come back, the sound's come back.
It's come back.
So maybe.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Mechayim Eti. Okay. Vayomer Hashem el Avram. We've barely heard of Avram. All we've heard is about the start of his married life. Can't have children, his wife. That's all we've heard.
But you'll need it on her computer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good thing you're fit. So, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha. Why Avram? The Ramban asked the question very seriously. We haven't heard anything particular to his, about how distinguished he was. What a distinguished human being he was. Nothing, actually. Why did God choose him for this crucial moment, this crucial departure from the attainments of the human race to something else, something more intense? So why does God choose Avram? That's the question. Yomer Hashem Avram Lech Lecha. Lech, where? Oh, El Haaretz Asher Areka. To the land which I'll show you. In other words, Lech doesn't mean, as it so often does, when you have Lech El, it means go on a journey to a specific destination. You travel, it's like traveling, you travel towards something. Here it is towards something, but you have no idea. Your knowledge will not contain a sense of what that destination is. Why did God do this? We have a look at your source page now. Rashi, number 1. Asher Areka, it's a few lines down, which I will show you. Lo gila lo haaretz miyad, kedei lechabeva be'inav. God didn't reveal to him the land right away. He didn't tell him where he was going. The text is pointing out what God didn't do. Now that's an exercise in imagination. Right? You might just have read very straightforward way, I'll go to the land which I will show you. And Rashi is pointing out, oh, but do you notice what God didn't do here? Which would have been obvious. Why didn't he do it? You know, what is this absence that invites our imagination? To make it precious in his eyes. Chaviv, chiba.
Sorry, what line?
Pardon? It's a few lines down in number 1. Yes, do you see Asher Areka, which I shall show you?
Yes.
You see it?
Thank you.
Yes. He didn't reveal. In other words, the text is, God is really saying to Abraham, part of his communication is, I'm not telling you. Now, does it sound right? If God goes out of his way to say Asher Areka, you can take it positively. You know, I will tell you, or you can hear that echo of another world, and that's a world in which you have to notice things. You have to pay attention. You have to notice. Isn't that rather strange? I'm not being told. Why did God not tell? In order to make the land, more precious in his eyes. Chaviv. And that word chaviv interests me. It's love, obviously. Chiba is love, affection, a kind of intimate affection. I looked it up in Jastrow, and what I came up with, some interesting translations. To cherish, for instance. Now, I like that word, to cherish. There's a tenderness here. No, tenderness is not enough. Actually, tenderness comes from the word tender, which means to use your hands. Yeah. To hold something dear, or to caress. I came up with that too. That when you are mechavev something, it's that kind of, it's hands-on. You cultivate an intensity. You don't just think, oh yes, in my heart, there's a feeling of love for this person. But it's that kind of living love, which one has for children, for instance. When you have a child anywhere near you, who are doing some of the nicer things that children do, then there is that sense of intimate involvement and wanting to go to overflow one's limits somehow. And you're actively cherishing this child in your mind, if not in your hands. And that's what that Abraham is through the journey into the unknown. The obvious part of that would be anxiety, I would think. He would feel anxious, every day I get up, I don't know where I'm going. Right? And there are midrashim that talk about that. Tirul meshugazeh. People talk about him as if he's crazy, that he's constantly traveling. He doesn't know where he's going. But that's a meshuga, literally.
The anxiety can overcome the chiba.
That's right. On the one hand, you have anxiety. And on the other hand, Rashi doesn't mention the anxiety at all. Maybe because that's obvious. And he wants to say something that's not obvious. Because there is that cherishing impulse, which actually is not, it can live together with anxiety, it seems to me. But because of the anxiety, somewhere one draws on other resources. Right? One may, let's say there's a child who has problems, who has developmental problems or whatever. So there's an anxiety, but there's a great tenderness that's like an active force in the same connection. So here, what do we? So this is Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Precious is the human being who's created in the image of God. We come back to that. Okay, what does it mean? Precious, lovable. Someone loves the human being. The human being is lovable, worthy of that kind of cherishing. It's a praise of what it is to be a human being, because he's created in the image of God. But chiba yetera, exceeding love, overflowing love, noda'at lo shenivra b'tzelem. If he is conscious of being created in the image of God, because if he is conscious, he's not just sort of sitting there being in the image of God. He is being challenged in a way to imagine himself in the image of God. What does that mean? How do I do that? In what sense could I possibly be in other words, it helps one to go beyond the surface and to think, what do I have to do? How do I have to be? How do I have to form myself really to be in the image of God? It's a challenge of some kind. I remember as a child, my mother used to, she had a photograph of her father on the wall. And there was a whole tragic story. The Iron Curtain, Romania, she hadn't seen him for many years. And we grew up with a real sense of the awe, and he was a Talmid Chacham and a very special person. And my mother then told me one day, you're like him. So, as a child, I look at him and I look at me, and from a point of view of surfaces, there's nothing to talk about. And so it gets my imagination going. In what way could a little girl, be like a bearded elderly man? So something about the analogy already, it gets your imagination going. And it's a creative imagination. It's imagination that goes to recreate you, to mold you, not recreate in the sense of, whoop, you're transformed, but that there is material in you that can be worked. There's material there that can be worked, and perhaps I can do something in the creation of myself. Maybe when God said to Abraham, Lech lecha, and to come now to that word lecha, he's actually telling him, bring to reality, bring into full being that deepest part of yourself that wants to be created. But until you pay attention to it, it will not be created. They'll be there as a kind of passive part of you. But once you notice it, there's an active focus of attention, something else begins to happen. I have a nice quote here. Yes. From thank you. From Neville Symington, who is That's one of the eminent psychoanalysts nowadays. He says, understanding comes when something within the personality received attention, a focused attention. I begin to understand myself and my place in the world when something in me that I wasn't aware of begins to receive attention from someone. Someone is using their imagination in looking at me. Someone is seeing me as something. Maybe I can now begin to see myself through that prism. And then I begin to understand something more. Right? So it's a dynamic that depends somewhere on people imagining each other. How are you ever going to grow without having in some way met other people? And you both have an imagination and you both misread each other. There's no question about it. There's no reality. There's no realism in how people see each other. We see each other either benignly or malignly or under the force of a kind of creative force in ourselves, which you could call imagination. You could say it's fantasy. You could say it's too bad that we live like that. But the fact is that we do. And that's, at least it seems to me, that that's the case. So if we come back to Abraham, who is Abraham? What's the depth of Abraham that has to be discovered by God? And that Abraham's dearest wish, in a way, is that it should be discovered. That Abraham is in some way walking around thinking Abraham Ayin. As we said before, Adam Ayin. There is no Adam yet. That Avram is walking around thinking, I don't know who I am yet. He may not be thinking it consciously, but when God calls to him out of the blue, it's just because he's asking himself that question. Let's have a look at the first midrash, which is very famous and very important. It's right at the beginning of Midrash Rabbah on Lech Lecha, number 3. Yes, Vayomer Hashem el Abraham, Lech Lecha me'artzecha. Rabbi Yitzchak Patach. Quotation from Psalms. Shim'i bat Uri. Listen, daughter. We don't know who this daughter is. Listen, daughter, and see. V'hati oznech, and incline your ear. V'shikchi amech uvet avich. And forget your father and your home and your people and the house of your father. Who is that? Obviously, in the context of Lech Lecha, that must be Abraham. Abraham is the young girl. How do we know? Because it says he should leave his people and the house of his father. So it's almost like a quotation. It's a resonance between the two verses. Who is the young woman here in the story? Clearly, it becomes clear that she is a young bride who has been, how shall I say it? She's been entered into marriage with a husband, a king who lives far away. And someone says to her, someone who loves her, says to her, you know what you should do? Alert your senses. Listen, see, you go beyond the surface. Forget all the perceptions and memories that you've had up to now. They are, in a way, stable images. Let's see what happens when you open yourself up to something else. And then instead of satisfying your curiosity and telling us really what we're talking about here, the Midrash veers away and goes into the mashal, the parable, which is another act of imagination. First is the act of imagination of Avram as a bride. I mean, that's quite imaginative. That male, female. He's male and female. From a certain point of view, he is female. And we can't help reading this somewhere with some awareness of gender discussions. But apparently Chazal are not shocked to do this kind of thing. To say that Avraham, without blinking, can be compared to a young bride. Let's say there's a human, the common humanity, but I think it goes further than that. That Avram has within him something of that young bride in this very different situation. And then we go off and onto the sidetrack. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, the same Chacham. This is like, here's a parable of someone, Echad, who was traveling from place to place. Over mimakom, he's constantly in transit. He's in a voyage. He doesn't stay any place. And he saw a castle on fire. Bira achat doleket. This is the famous Bira doleket that starts off the midrashic exploration of Abraham and Lech Lecha. There is a castle on fire. I just want to note that there is another reading of Bira doleket, which reads it a castle illumined, all alight. That is obviously full of life, full of good things happening. There's a lot of light in this castle. But the other reading is just the opposite. It's a catastrophic reading. It's on fire. And immediately this traveler says, would you say that this castle is without someone in charge? According to the negative reason, that would be rather a plausible thing to say, wouldn't it? But according to the positive reading, it would be a kind of incredulous, it would be a rhetorical question. You really say this obviously this castle is not without someone. And the fact that you have both these possibilities at once, I think, is what creates the imaginative life of the image. Yeah. There's an ambiguity about it. It's not just this or that, but somewhere the two possibilities begin to work together. They begin to work on each other. And then what happened? It sits alav balabira, the resolution of Abraham's question. The owner of the castle, who Abraham said didn't exist, Hitzitz alav. Hitzitz. He glanced out at him. Hatzatza. So it's a fairly ordinary rabbinic word for to look at someone, but it does have that particular a glance, I would say. It's like a brief, piercing glance. Let's say you can see a ray of light coming from God from the owner of the castle to engage Abraham, and he says, "Ani Bal Habira," pleased to meet you. That's a little bit frivolous, but it's me. Now, what is happening? That's the end. That's the end of that little parable. And then we go back to the bride, and we'll come back to her in a minute. Meantime, just to notice, he sits alav. He peered at him. He glanced at him. I'm going to take you now, before we finish this midrash, I'm going to take you to way ahead to number 7 on your page. Let's see, what is number 7? No, it's number 6. Number 6 on your page. Number 6. The Meah Shiloach. Meah Shiloach, great 19th century Hasidic master, who always has something provocative to say, who is imaginative to the nth degree. And I would say in an entirely positive sense. What do we have here? He starts off with a passage, number 7. If you look at it in the translation, if that's helpful.
English.
The English, it's number 6, yes. It starts off with a quotation from Yeshayahu, which seems to have nothing to do with the subject. Ki etzak mayim al sameh v'nozlim al yabasha. When I pour out water upon the thirsty and streams upon the dry land. That is, we have that pasuk about the idea again of water. We're never going to get very far from water today. The effect of liquid on dryness. And here you have a sense of the active need of the dry land and of the thirsty person for the water. That is, it sounds as if the water is doing all the activity and the dry land is just sitting there. But actually, the land is actively thirsty. The land is waiting for water, in imagination. If you use an imaginative prism, which clearly is asked for here, there is a relationship here which is based on longing and desire and the unconscious and dynamic things, not just, well, the rain falls on the dry, it's not a factual description. Yes, when Abraham began to seek and quest after the root of his own life, how do we know he ever did such a thing? It's a pure invention on the part of, as the Midrash takes it upon itself, Mea Shiloach here, takes it upon himself to imagine Abraham as a desirous, imaginative human being. And a human being who's not satisfied with all the goods of this world, because what he is looking for is not like the philosophers said it. Rambam, for instance, it's on your page there, but I'm not going to look at it today. That he was like the philosopher who was asking questions about what makes the world spin, what makes the sphere spin. So there's a force that makes the world spin, but what makes that spin? And then you go back and back and back. You ask questions, what's the cause of that? What's the cause of that? Until you get up to an ultimate cause, the first cause, and that must be God. That's the philosopher's narrative about how Abraham came to know God. This is a very different narrative. What Abraham is moved by, makes him travel everywhere, is to find the root of his own life. Shorish hachayim shelo. He's trying to solve a puzzle about himself. He is troubled about himself. We'll see that the word trouble comes up afterwards. Why am I like this? Why do I need nobody else? Why do I need all the time to be looking for things that are beyond? It's that kind of existential trouble. And he wants to know what can be called true life. B'shem chayim amitiyim. He's looking for guf hachayim, the body of life. It's a strange expression. The solid, I don't know how to translate that otherwise, the body of life on which the world was created. That is, the basis of creation must be a beating pulse of some kind. There is a life that's living. What is that really? Did you want to say
I
something?
like when she said the core of life.
The core, yeah, it's there in the translation, but it's a kind of living core. The heart of the volcano, or what's at the heart of it all? And it's almost like getting your hands into it. He's mechapes umrakesh. It's not just a theoretical. It's sensual. I hope you don't misunderstand me, right? It's a kind of imagining of what that sensuality in us does for us in the world, how it forms us and shapes us. And that's what he's looking for. It's very immediate. Ikara chayim. And God then says to him, look at yourself. Lech lecha. Don't know. First of all, go to yourself. Lech lecha. Not just the usual reading, of course, of Lech lecha is that the lecha doesn't mean anything. Again, that's just a kind of received reading. It's common sensible. It's borne out by linguistic analogies. Kach lecha. It's just a little enclitic, the Greeks called it. It's a little word that's given there for swing. Lech lecha. Just get going. It gives a rhythm to the sentence. No, says the Midrash and Chassidut in general. It means go to yourself. Now, that won't do with respectable scientific people. But if you have an imagination, you can't help giving it space. Lech lecha, God says to him, don't look all around you for answers to your question. Don't ask scientific questions. Go into yourself. Lecha, and there you will find Ikar Chayim Timtza B'cha. And quotes from Yeshayahu, V'ata tagil b'Hashem, and you shall rejoice in God, with the emphasis on V'ata. Your you-ness, the essence of your subjectivity, say, that subjectivity in you will rejoice in God. When you meet, when there is a connection with God, that's when you'll feel most intensely alive. You'll have to notice that. You will know it not because of some philosophical proof, but by your own reactions. And that's life, he says. That reaction is life. In the sense that life is a verb rather than a noun. It's in the plural, and it's a sense of something that's acting rather than just it is. Life isn't. Life is lifing, as someone once said to me, for good and for bad. Yeah, life just has a thing it does. And you want to find that. And then we come to our midrash. And the owner of the castle glances out at him, it sits. It really should say, it sits elav. That's the idiom, to look at someone. Why does it say alav? This is wonderful stuff. He looked at Abraham, who is a responsive, it's a reflexive attention. He's saying, look at you. I'm looking at you, and my glance is telling you, you are of utmost interest. Not you as you are now only, but you in all your becomingness, in all your trouble. Look how troubled you are. At the question about, is there an owner to the castle? Look around you. No one else is worried about these questions. You are the only one who's in torment. Here, im libo, the word that's used is reish ayin men, which means to be turbulent. It's not a pleasant state of mind, right? It means to be unsatisfied, to be stormy. It's a kind of commotion, kind of not things in order and coherence. You are, yes. No one else is, but you are. Your question is already the answer. Your kushia, he's deliberately using the word that's used about in the Gemara for an intellectual question, a question in reading. And then there is the teretz, the answer to the question. But he's applying it not to an intellectual issue, but to an issue of turmoil, of emotional turmoil in Abraham. And that itself should tell him something. That is, if you reflect on yourself, right, it's not narcissism. It's not a way of saying, well, I'm very self-involved. In a way, it's very difficult to reflect on oneself. You never know what you come up with there. And Avram is not enjoying being the way he is now. He doesn't know where to turn. And God says to him, and this is an answer for a time. I think the Meah Shiloach can put it exactly like that, because he lives in the 19th century, when such ideas are out there in the world, of looking into the romantic idea. But here it's really grounded in a reality, that he's looking around at the world and he's saying, I don't know what to think. You know, either it's, on the one hand, it's obvious there must be, and on the other hand, I don't see how it can be. And there are different moments and different, so he's somewhere in a storm of feeling. And God says to him, that storm itself is an indication to you that you are in a process, that you are, and that's the attention now, the focused attention. That's supposed to let Abraham begin to understand something about his journey, about where he's going. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, who was his student, who was the student of the Meah Shiloach, one of the great Hasidic masters of the 19th century also. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, yes, in a book called Tzidkat HaTzadik, takes his teacher's words and just pushes them a little further, to the point almost of gasping, like, oh, really? Are you really going to say that? And basically what he says, like his teacher says, I am the one, God is the one who has aroused your heart to this kind of turmoil. When you identify this turmoil in yourself, know that it's what, in a way, comes from God. Yeah, that's a real mixing up of things. It's at the end of Meah Shiloach. V'hu he'ir libcha. At the end, number 7, yes, Meah Shiloach. He aroused your heart and soul to this mode. He is the cause of your trouble, your turbulence. Rabbi Tzadok Cohen, who I didn't put on your page, takes it a little further. And he says something like this. He says, your trouble is me. It's not, you can deduce that God gave me this trouble. It's that somewhere that's my presence in your heart. Shchinat, something about Mekom Shchinati belibcha. The place of my dwelling, my presence, is in your heart. Now, from a certain point of view, that's nothing very new. You know, the place of the Shekhinah, you know, as being in the human heart. We say that. Again, it depends how you hear it. There's something a little bit extra there, which Rabbi Tzadok Cohen allows himself. A sense of, I'm not so sure what comes from me and what comes from God. You know, it's not absolutely black and white. That I share something with God by dint of being made by God. There's some ground for saying that his imagination and my imagination, you know, there could be an interrelational, something could be happening here. Not in order to make any claims of any kind, but actually to sense more the holiness of God's presence, to know that if it's found anywhere, that's where it's found. And in the ambiguity of the human heart has many phases. So if we go there, then what does it mean to say that Abraham recognizes his creator? He recognizes him through, God says to him, look at you. Look at you. Begin to form yourself now, or continue to form yourself in that direction. And that's the way imagination works in terms of South Indian culture. People expose themselves to works of art, to works of imagination, theater, dance, among a group of people. And these performances go on day after day after day, for something like 10 days, many hours every day, until everyone is in a kind of trance. It's very different, right? But then we can break it down. Everyone is in a trance in which they are being formed into the characters of the drama. They feel, they identify very deeply. And they see a possibility for their own lives that they couldn't have seen if they hadn't been involved in this process. It's like a therapeutic process of some kind. Well, Kol Nidre, Ne'ilah, right? We are with other people. We are with a powerful Baal Tefillah. And something in us gets moving. And we can't say it's just me. And we can't say it's without God's presence. That God's presence is palpable in some level and to some extent. You know, everyone according to who they are. And something of that strange, malleable nature, are you going to call that imagination, or are you going to call that dvekut, or there are many ways of talking about it. But I think imagination has to do with this, exactly with this creation of a new world. Abraham was the first and the best exemplar of this. Yitzchak already has a different idiom and a different way that he has to think about himself, and Yaakov certainly. But Abraham has what Rabbi Tzadok Cohen calls darga d'ani. His starting place, the place from which he begins to live, and this formative process, which never ends, is from ani. Ani bel habira, the self, the focus on the self, not the focus on ata, for instance. That will be later. Ata means you have revealed yourself to me, but more a sense of the processes of one's own consciousness. And that's where the story begins. That's how he first comes to know his creator. Go back to the original midrash to finish it with the bride. Go back to the bride. Number 3, yes. Go back to Tehillim. She's supposed to look and listen and forget her father's house. And the king shall desire your beauty, for he is your Lord. Sounds like, and I say that she is traveling into a new existence in which her beauty will become the focus of attention. She's never thought about it before. Maybe, yes. And in that life of desire, you will find a self that you don't yet know. You'll move and undergo that journey, even though it involves some anxiety and some moving into. But Midrash is not satisfied with the text here and slightly adjusts the text. He will desire your beauty? No. Liyapotech ba'olam. God, the king, will desire to make you beautiful in the world. That is, what the king will want of you is not to enjoy your beauty. It's to make your beauty even more beautiful, to intensify your beauty for the sake of the world. That you should be a force in the world. Now, this is a very altruistic husband. Yes. He's not looking for anything for himself, but he's regarding Abraham as excellent material. That you have the rudiments of beauty, whatever beauty can stand for, whatever wisdom, piety, power of certain kinds. And I want to sharpen those and go to yourself, and then to go out into the world and teach, go out into the world and affect the world in some way. So there's an educational process going on here for the sake of the king is going to in some way help her intensify who she is. And I mean, it's not beyond the bounds of imagination. I can even in my reading, even my own experience.
Yeah, you get it better.
Pardon?
You have to have the double experience. First
Yeah.
to have it, and then
That's
to
right.
see it red coat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there is a doubleness about it, but this is the imaginative move onwards. Okay, so with this, then we move to the next Midrash, number 7. It's so difficult for me to keep things in order. There must be a simple technique. Here it is. Yeah. Yes. Okay, number 7. Vayomer Hashem el Avram. Right? It's in the same, right at the beginning of Midrash Rabbah, the beginning on Lech Lecha. Rabbi Brachya Patach. L'reach shmanecha tovim. Your ointments yield a sweet smell. Again, we're in the realm of the sensual. There's no talking about abstractions here. Your ointments yield sweet smell. Shemen turak shemecha, your name, that's the translation of the image. Your name, and then we're back into imagery again. Your name is like the finest oil. And we have to we're dealing with a different sense. We talked about seeing and hearing. And now we're talking about smell. That Abraham is like the smell of precious perfume. Let's see how it continues now. What was Abraham like? We're talking about images, representations. He was like a flask of balsamic essence. That's the translation I found. That is not exactly perfume. I'm not sure exactly what it smells like. I know that you put it in food. I don't know. I would like to think of perfume as a pure essence, but let's see here. It's like a flask of precious essence, which is tightly fitting lid. So none of the smell diffuses into the world. It's locked in to the bottle. What then happens? lo haya rechonodev, but when the bottle was opened and shaken, mitaltelet, waved around, an interesting movement, mitaltel. Latul, lintol, is to take something. If you double it, taltel, it's this agitated to and fro. There's two things involved here, not one. There's a certain agitation in it, mitaltelet. I looked up the word, and I always look it up again just to make sure. Taltel means to shake up, to be confused, to be distraught, to be deranged, to lose balance. It means to be homeless, banished, decentered. What else do I have here? Yes, it means to swing, letzaltel, to swing, to hurl, to be in exile. Road fatigue. There's a word for road fatigue that's taltelet in modern Hebrew. What is it? Road fatigue. In other words, it's journeying. This is Abraham's journey. Literally and imaginatively. That it throws him out of balance. And here he's being told, do that to yourself. Taltel atzmacha. Yes? So God said to Abraham, Taltel atzmacha mimakom makom. Right? Form yourself as a wanderer, as someone who surrenders to that kind of consciousness. Yeah? B'shimcha mitgadel ba'olam. And then your name will become great in the world, which is what God says to Abraham. It will become, I won't have to make it great. It will become great in its, if you travel around, then you will affect people and people will know you and so on. So it has a down-to-earth meaning. Simply, if you travel, you'll become known. That's right. And if you travel and teach, then you'll become like the Rambams. Abraham, you'll become a great teacher, and in the end, you'll write books, and you'll become a scholar. But clearly, the Midrash has in it other layers. So it's dealing here with the inwardness of Abraham as well, the essence which is his inwardness, and the question now of how does one form oneself as a subject that's capable of forming the world, of creating a world, and creating oneself. Now, that's based on the notion that we all have the power to create ourselves and our world. It takes a lot of, it's hard to hold to that sometimes. Reality becomes very strong, sometimes sickeningly strong. And the realists have always said that. Let's see how idealist you are. You knock your foot against a rock. Oh, does it hurt? The rock exists, never mind your imagination. But as we also know, there are many forces of suggestion and imagination and thinking, speculating about one's own situation, which can indeed form and transform, deform and transform reality. Sometimes we call that sick. This person is not in touch with reality. But if it's done well, it creates its own coherence, it creates its own process. There's an intensification here. Abraham is being encouraged to intensify himself. How? By not bottling himself up, by not keeping himself apart, but having the evidence of who he is from his effect on the world, becoming perfume, in other words, really doing perfume rather than just being somewhere hidden inside himself. Taltel, lech lecha. That lech lecha has a tiltul in it. It has that restlessness. Could have just said lech. That would have been static. But we want to disturb that stable, completed image. We want in some way not to clip the wings of the imagination. So we say taltel, and it could be quite distressing. And from that taltel, we move to tal. And we're back to liquids. Now, there's no mention in the text of tal, of dew at this point. So there's no excuse for the Midrash to do this. The next Midrash on your page, number 8. Lecha tal yadutecha. It's a pasuk from, I should have checked this. anyone has it online, you could check it perhaps, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe Psalms. What it means is, to you is the dew of your youth. The dew of your youth, that's an image, imagination. Dew, youth, belongs to you. And that's the lecha in Lech Lecha. It evokes that dew. What are we doing here? Lefi shehaya avinu Avraham mitpached, because Abraham was suffering from anxiety. So it turns out that Abraham is open to anxiety. That anxiety really is a part of his. And next week we'll look at what led up to the Akedah, and we'll see there's a great and deep anxiety in Abraham. He's not someone who just sails off blissfully. Oh, God told me to go, I'm going. You know, that's emunah. And I'm also trying to talk about emunah, but emunah as a process that starts from a subject that is active, not just, oh, you demand it of me and I produce it. So what do we have here? Where does the dew come in? Abraham was anxious, and he was saying, perhaps I have in my hand sin. Perhaps sin clings to me because I worshipped idols all those early years. You know, I was really deep in it then. Maybe it's still in me, and I'm walking around still, you know, the clay is sticky stuff. You know, it's not, some things there that I'm, you know, and that is Abraham. I mean, it's really astonishing that the Midrash is setting up this possibility for Abraham. God then said to him, no, the dew of your youth is for you. Just as dew diffuses, evaporates into the world, let's say evaporates, poreach, flies away. Dew is there, and then, you know, by the time you get up in the morning, depending, it's gone. So your sins fly away. Wow. So to compare his sins to dew is it's a happy comparison. To think, well, they were there, but they're no longer there. They were there at the beginning. Just as this dew is a sign of blessing to the world, and notice a sign of blessing, just an indication of blessing. It's a hint of blessing. It's not clearly it does the world good, you know, follow the biological, botanical effects of dew on the flower and so on. It's just an indication, a very minor, delicate indication. There's a drop of dew there. So you are a sign of blessing to the world. It's not that you founded monotheism and I'm really proud of you. It's not in those terms. It's you are a sign of blessing. There's something about you that gives a hint to the world of a possibility of imaginative power. I want to share with you, just for the pleasure of it, a notion that I get from Adam Phillips, the British psychoanalyst. In one of his books, he investigates the idea of hints, because in psychoanalysis too, hints go a long way. You know, the analyst, the therapist, doesn't necessarily spell out what they want to say. They just. So what he does is he investigates three great thinkers, poets, artists, who talked about hints. The first one is Keats, who says it's better to be a flower than to be a busy bee, to be the passive one than the active one who's, you know, just buzzing around everywhere and full of itself. What does the flower do? The flower takes hints from every noble insect that visits it. That is, the noble insects come and it just receives a hint, nothing more. It's a little jab, a little something. And that's how an artist should be. That's how everybody should be, everyone who has a developed consciousness. It's a very famous letter in which he talks about this. There's a certain kind of passivity. It's apparent passivity. Avram could have been traveling and never moving, you know, physically. That is, there's a sense here of the essential, Keats called it diligent indolence. You know, what looks like a kind of laziness. You're just sitting there waiting for the bee to come, but you are receptive and you are resonant to the bee. You take it in. Or Wittgenstein was asked by someone if he liked Kierkegaard's work. We're talking philosophy now. And he says he got hints. He doesn't like thought all chewed up. He doesn't need someone else's thoughts, you know, all premasticated for him. What he likes is a hint that gets him going.
Who's he?
Wittgenstein.
About himself.
Out himself. Yeah. So Kierkegaard's too much for him. You know, it's too fully worked out. He likes people who are generative. You know, that's a word we haven't used yet, which is an important word. And I would add another one. He likes chesed. What is chesed? Chesed is not necessarily only loving kindness. Loving kindness is one form of chesed. But it's with chesed that God creates the world. Olam chesed yibaneh. The world is built up through chesed. The original world was built by chesed Hashem. God didn't have to extend himself, you know, and go beyond his total rule into a world of things being mixed up. Right? There he was, perfectly coherent, perfectly stable, as it were. And then he goes and creates a turbulent world. That's an act of chesed. He's giving life and turbulence and choice, although I'm not emphasizing the choice part, I'm emphasizing more the unconscious movements, to a world that can create itself. Now that's chesed. Abraham was the first person who created being. He's called in the 89th Psalm, Tehillim Peitet, begins, Maskil le'etan ha'ezrachi. Maskil is, I think it's the name of a genre, I'm not sure exactly, of psalm. And it was sung by Eitan ha'ezrachi. Who is Eitan ha'ezrachi? And again, the Midrash will say, Eitan is Abraham. And Eitan can be connected, Rav Hutner suggests, with the Aramaic word eight, which means yesh. He was the first person to create awareness, a positive reality out of ayin, which is what God did. To create out of a confused world some sense of there is me, for instance, that I've discovered some language for talking from a subject. And if I've learned it, then, you know, I want to pass it on to other people, or somewhere on that very deep level. Before we get to Torah, you know, there's no Torah as such yet. Although Chazal will say that he did keep Torah, you know, milchik and fleshik and everything. But the point is that his was the foundation, that he did what God did in his life, that he brought himself into being and he brought other people into being. And he could only have done that if he had in him God's attribute, which is the attribute of chesed. So that it gets to mean loving kindness, but the basic thing is the capacity for moving beyond the ayin into a potential reality, complex reality, perhaps. The third case of hints in
Doctor, can you just repeat again what Rav Hutner said?
Rav Hutner.
His interpretation of eight.
Yes, he suggests, because he takes it from a concordance, which I actually have. It's a slightly old-fashioned concordance, a Mindelkorn, and he suggests that eitan comes from the root eight, and that which means in Aramaic yesh, and it's come to mean eitan comes to mean a giant or a very solid, strong person. That's so it's like a giant, but it's really the concept here of finding a sensual reality, you know, finding So, yes, so the third person who uses hints, I think, he says the mind takes to itself the faintest hints of life. That what we do when we live, as we we move through the world, is not that we wait for tremendous revelations, wait for life writ large. That what we do is we are affected by the smallest things. Someone smiles at me in the morning. I smile at someone. Someone glances, and there is suddenly something flowers. Suddenly there is a sense that there's an alternative world. It's not a world of the newspapers, giving reality its due. So, given that now, let's come to the final midrashic source.
Could you say who says mind takes the thing?
I'm sorry.
Who says mind takes?
Yes, that was Henry James. And if you read his work, if you know his work.
Henry James?
Pardon?
Did you just say Henry James?
Henry James. What did I say?
Did you quote Henry James just now?
I did. Didn't I say so?
You did say so.
Yeah,
But
no,
it was
no.
the third one.
You
didn't say.
said the
No, you
third
didn't
one.
say that.
I was
It's a
waiting
good
for
thing
that.
It's a good thing that you correct me.
I
Okay.
don't
Give us a hint.
I gave you a hint and then you knew what you had to say. I'm very glad. Thank you very much. Aging is not necessary. So yes. So what was the question?
You said that.
Oh, you wanted me to?
I think just that they want what you said about Henry.
Yes,
James.
let's go
Not
back to the
waiting for-
midrash now. The dew of your youth. All right, that was
Okay.
that was the dew of your youth. What are we talking about here? The dew evaporates. Your sins evaporate.
Simon, we're talking about a
A
simon.
simon bracha. That's where I took off from.
Yeah.
Right. The idea of something very delicate, almost not there, tal, like the perfume, a little bit of liquid, that's almost not there, and then it ceases to be right away, just disappears, but it has an effect. And Shem Mishmal, another of the great Hasidic masters of the 19th century, comes up.
What was his name?
I don't
Oh,
remember.
sorry.
Yes, no,
Number 10.
I know, but it's not
Okay.
there. Yesh lehavin maha matzal b'ta- What is this? What is this metaphor, this parable of the flying away dew, the dew that flies away? What is all that about? And he quotes his father, who speaks about a pasuk in Hosea and about a Gemara that discusses it. So it's a little bit multi-layered. Let me try to unravel it. Have a look at number 9. There is the Gemara that Israel asked for something that was inappropriate, but God answered Israel appropriately. What is that? Verse from Hosea. The people are all gung-ho. V'neid'a nirdefa ladat et Hashem. Let us know and pursue to know God. Right, there they are, full gallop, trying to know God. Let's go in pursuit of the knowledge of God. And he will be like the dawn, which appears on time, and it comes like rain to us. So it's a complex image of something that comes as a clear blessing. And if we go in pursuit of it, then we'll have a nice rainfall. We'll have a good rainfall, water again. Amar la Kadosh Baruch Hu, God said to Israel, my daughter, you ask for something that is sometimes desirable and sometimes not desirable. You don't always want a heavy fall of rain. I'm going to be to you something I give you a different image. I'm going to change your imagery. I'm going to just edit your imagination a little bit. Not rain, dew. Veheye ketal li'Yisrael. I shall be like dew to Israel. Also in Hosea, not very far away from you. And the Chazal then imagine that as a conversation between the two sources, not Geshem, Tal. What's the difference? Shem Mishmal goes on to say this. What's the difference between rain and dew? And he again becomes very sensual about it. You feel it. You feel the difference. What does rain do? It thoroughly moistens the earth, and stays there statically. You can see the rain go out in the morning and you see all the puddles and God answered and said, but there's a problem with that. You shouldn't be imagining me like rain because, and this is the interpretation of the Shem Mishmot, because if that is what I am to you, then my relationship with you will not be because of yourselves. It won't be caused by you. It'll only be caused by me. I will fall like the rain, and you will see the signs of it in the morning, and you'll say, God has visited us with blessing. That's not good. It has to be a cooperation of some kind. It has to be that God awakens us like the dew does, right? It's an image that the dew falls almost not there and awakens the inner vitality of the flower. It's almost adds nothing, and it will be gone afterwards. It does its work. It does the work of hints. And that's what I want to be to you. God prefers that, even though there are moments of rain and there are moments of flood. There are moments of destructive flood, and in the tradition, in the mystical tradition, the flood is seen as an overdoing of chesed. Something has gone haywire. There's too much water. There's just too much water around. Man who is made of flour and water can easily be dispersed and made into nothing by too much water. Just drown it out and it's gone. That's the mabul. What you want is the right mixture. And the Shem Mishmor then goes on to finish his interpretation. He says this: your sins are like that. Your sins are like dew, in that perhaps there wasn't that much of them to start with. It wasn't so bad. It was like that, but it had an invigorating effect on you. It had an effect of hitorurut. It was part of your journey. It woke you up. He puts it in a very clear way. He says that you were part of the idol worship, and then you grew to realize that this is not it. This is not right. And that pushed you further on your journey. So your sins actually had a very beneficial effect on you, you might say. It had the effect of a hint, in this case, a negative hint. I'm a little uneasy with that. I don't think it's in my sense of things. It's not the Platonic idea that you start with a human love and then you throw away the ladder, and once you reach the higher love, the human love, right? There's that sense of moving in one's idea of love from concrete humanity to something higher. I don't think the ladder gets kicked away exactly. And Aram is right to worry, because there are residues, but on the whole, everything negative has evaporated, and what remains is what was useful to him in his right. So it's not a static gift that he was given, something nishalbe. It's something that aroused his own powers. Aroused one's own powers. He says something about nukudata. Hanukuda hapnimit shebelibo, the innermost point of his heart. It's very Hasidic, right? The almost invisible dot in his heart woke up, was awakened by his interaction with Avodah Zarah. That there was something in that spoke to him, and then he began to realize that's not the language. That's not the right language. But so that what he's left with is the hitorurut. What he's left with is simply that. Arousal is, of course, a very potent image, and it's everywhere in Hasidic writings. Hasidic writings are interested in these micronized realities, like perfume, drops of things that are very intense. And so the imagination we're talking about then, I think, has to do with things, with movements of the spirit that are not based on, clashing symbols, that are based really on the activity of the mind in internalizing and intensifying the effect of what seemed to be, you know, not minor things. Any immediate reactions?
So I'm feeling very literal minded this morning.
Mhm.
I'm feeling very literal minded
Okay,
this
okay.
morning. And so I was thinking about sort of Rashi's image of the bread and kneading the dough.
Yes.
And think, okay, well, it's really more than just bread and water, it's bread and water plus culture.
Bread and water
And I mean, it's fleshing flour and water plus culture.
becomes ketchup.
Yeah, you know, take when you bread. Oh, I'm thinking about how reverently French bakers talk about their sourdough starter.
Yeah.
Look at the culture.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, yes, yes.
And so there's something that is both intangible but present, it's something that's transmitted. And so what's one's needing, one is always working in the first person flow.
Yeah. Very, very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yes.
I was going to say on the same topic that this lushing sort of the messiness of life is embedded in the universe.
Yeah.
It's actually the second principle of thermodynamics, which is the entropy of the world tends towards the maximum.
You're fun. You're fun. You know, you've got going. There's a kind of that's exactly what we're talking about. You know, that it's not just, oh, that's very nice, but immediately,
Makes you think.
yeah.
And it makes something positive of the word a moving experience.
Yeah.
To be moved,
It's
it's really, but it's also to get shaken up.
to get shaken up. Sometimes it's disturbing.
I know
Sometimes.
it's like, I think motherhood doesn't want anything to change.
יופי, חיכיתי לך. אז הייתי בסוף השיעור עכשיו שמסתיים, אז אני אשמח לדבר, בדקתי את הקונצרט וגם עם
Thank you, everybody.
אתמול כמה מקומות פנויים, כן, בירושלים. כן. כן, אני ראיתי